Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is part of a continuing lecture on Aristotle's virtue ethics. What we're looking at today is the concept of justice. And as you can see, I'm putting justice in here. I didn't include it in my original 9-part series. So if you've watched the first 4 parts, this might be a little bit of a surprise to you. But we're squeezing it in here because it's important to consider this chapter in the Nicomachean Ethics on justice. So to situate what we're talking about, I want to begin with a discussion of the Greek term, which is Descailloux Sunay. And I want to put this in the context of Plato. Now, if you go back to my very first lecture where I talk about who Aristotle is, you'll remember that Aristotle is a student of Plato. And of course, that's important. But what's more important here, I think, is the fact that Aristotle studies with Plato for 20 years. So I spent 2 years in a master's program and 7 years in a doctoral program. So 9 years in the doctoral program. I did happen to work with my dissertation director for many of those years. But as a one-on-one relationship, it was for about maybe 3 or 4 years. Whereas Aristotle here is working with Plato for 20 years. And so we have to remember the kind of influence that that kind of relationship is going to have, and the sort of discussion that Aristotle wants to have about justice. And that might help us to kind of clarify some of the things that we ourselves want to talk about. So, of course, very important for Plato's conception of justice is his work, The Republic, in which he lays out the ideal state and what the characteristics of the ideal state are. Now, the central concept in the Republic is Descailloux Sunay, which is typically translated as justice. Now, some discussions will note that this term in the Republic actually seems to have a broader perspective. So some scholars translate Descailloux Sunay as morality, trying to capture the whole sense of the moral world and not just justice. And so Plato says, and Aristotle will say this later, that justice is the first of the virtues and covers all the other virtues. And so that sort of captures some of what we mean by morality, but I think the term morality is too modern to really think about what we're doing. Plato does talk through the mouth of Socrates, obviously, about Descailloux Sunay as, quote, the right way to live. And this might call to mind the translation of this term, Descailloux Sunay, in the Greek New Testament as righteousness. Again, this term has something to speak for it, so the idea of living a righteous life, but there's a bit of piety to that concept, particularly if we refer to the New Testament, that doesn't quite capture what Plato is talking about here. One of my favorite translations is from a former professor of mine, George Blair, who translated Descailloux Sunay as harmony. And it might be my grounding in Eastern philosophy and Taoism that makes me attracted to this concept, but I think there's something to be said for this in terms of what Plato is trying to do in the Republic. So if you recall, Plato is thinking about the concept of justice and trying to answer whether it is better to be just or if justice is opposed to happiness. And what he does is he sets up the nature of the state to get a better look at the nature of the soul. And so he says that there are 3 parts to the state: the guardians who rule with wisdom, the warriors who support the guardians, and then the artisans and others who take care of the everyday needs. Likewise, the individual person has reason, which supposedly rules the individual, and then we have spirit, which is supposed to support reason, and then we have our appetites, our desires, and that should obey reason. Of course, a person who has an imbalance here, whose appetite is too strong to be ruled, will not end in happiness. And a person whose spirit does not support reason, but in fact supports the appetite, will not end in happiness. Now, when I talk about spirit here, I don't mean sort of the Christian soul. What I'm talking about here is like, I really like chocolate cake, right? That's my spirit going for the desire for chocolate cake. So the concept of harmony here means that there's a balance or a harmony between the way these aspects of the soul work. And I think that's important to keep in mind whether we translate Descailloux Sunay in the Republic as justice or as harmony, to keep in mind that part of what Plato is doing here is to think about the whole person in this balance of three parts. Now, as we talked about in terms of virtue ethics early on in the second lecture, Aristotle does not share that same tripartite nature of the soul. He has a more divisive between reason and non-reason, and then reason itself has two parts, which we'll talk about when we come to the to the virtues of the intellect. So it's not quite the same sort of balance between these three parts, but on the other hand, there is a sort of harmony that must exist there. The other aspect of this is that for Plato, the harmony involves the appetite obeying reason and reason laying down the law. And for Aristotle, there's much more of not so much of a control by reason, but more of reason training the appetites. The other thing that we want to think about in terms of Plato is this expansive theory of justice. So Julia Annis says in her introduction to the Republic, justice is a virtue which regulates our relations with others. An expansive theory of justice will therefore make our relations with others central to the moral life and tend to stress the individual's relations in society as partly constitutive of moral attitudes. Now, when we get to Aristotle does not have the same quite expansive theory of justice as a virtue, but it does deal with our relations with others, as we will come to see. And there is something about justice that he wants to say is, in fact, about our whole moral attitude. So when we think about justice in Aristotle, he divides it into two kinds. Now, just to preface this, what we're talking about here is justice as a virtue, and at the end of Book 5 in the Nicomachean Ethics, he does talk about justice as a aspect of politics, and we can get into that when we go through the politics in some future lecture series. Now I'm focused only on the Nicomachean Ethics, and I really want to just focus on, in this lecture, justice as a virtue. And so we're not going to worry about political justice at the moment. So for Aristotle, justice as a virtue comes in two forms. There's the general justice, which we might think of as complete virtue. And so when we think about this expansive theory, or the idea of justice as being the whole of virtue, or being the first virtue, then that's really what we mean by complete virtue, and by this general notion of justice as a virtue. And Aristotle wants to give some credence to this, and I think that owes his commitment, that is due to his commitment and following of Plato, but he also wants to break away from that and talk about particular justice and break this down into the kind of particular virtue that we're talking about when we talk about the other kinds of virtues like bravery or phronesis. And so here he wants to contrast justice with pleonexia. Pleonexia is overreaching, or trying to grasp too many things. We might say too much desire or greed in some cases. But the idea that we want more than what we deserve. And so there's a notion of desert and a notion of owing here. Now, for Aristotle, this particular kind of justice involves two areas of life. So distribution of goods and rectification when there's a violation of justice. Now, when we talk about distribution of goods, it's interesting to note that Aristotle mentions mostly kinds of goods that we would say are external, or which are reducible to material goods, and he doesn't really talk about broader conceptions of goods, or goods that are not material goods. I don't think that there's any reason to believe that he doesn't imply that these other goods are subject to justice. but I think that how they will be subject to justice will be different because when we talk about non-material goods, often there's not a limit to the distribution of these goods. So if we were talking about the goods of friendship, it's not often that we say that these have limits and that if we're friends with one person, we can't be friends with another. Obviously, that happens in sometimes, but that's when friendships break down. It's not the same thing as saying, well, if you have $100 and there's only $150 in the pot, then I can only have 50, right? So there's something different there. So distribution of justice mainly applies to, at least in this case, material goods. And here, what Aristotle is looking for is a proportionality. And again, we go back to this idea of desert. So Aristotle is thinking about what each person deserves according to the contribution that the person makes to the common good or to the agreement that the persons have. So desert is important here, and desert is in part based on contribution, and that there has to be a proportionality here. Now, he doesn't answer some of the many questions that we might have. For example, what if someone doesn't have the ability to contribute? What kind of proportionality are we looking for? Are we looking for an equal division? Are we looking for those who have more to give to those who have less? That comes in with other virtues. So magnanimity refers to those who have great generosity and give to those who have less. So here we're talking about just kind of having a proportionality. When we talk about rectification, here we're talking about righting wrongs, of course, okay? And so, again, there's a mathematical formula here about restoring balance. So if you have 5 apples and I take 3 of them from you, then I have to restore the balance and give you back something equal to the 3 apples that I took from you so that you're not being treated unjustly. And again, we're not talking here about the sorts of things that we might talk about with Thomas Aquinas, where theft might be justified in cases where I have a need. Aristotle doesn't address that issue. He's simply talking about cases of rectification, and he doesn't make the kinds of qualifications that we might later make with interpreters of Aristotle like Thomas Aquinas. So what we see here in this discussion is that justice has a structural element to it. It's a very formal idea of proportionality or a mathematical distribution of things, and it involves the persons who are making contributions, or the persons from whom something is taken or someone takes from the other, and the kinds of relationships that they have and the contributions that they have. So Aristotle gets into this sort of nitty-gritty about this formal structure and what we're really looking for here, but it always comes back to this sort of proportionality that we're talking about. Now, his discussion here leaves open some questions. Two that I think are very important for us is, does this model fit the model of virtue as a mean that we've talked about in earlier lectures? And then what is the relationship between justice as virtue and political justice? I'm going to leave that question aside for further conversations, perhaps in another lecture series on the politics. But the idea here is that there is some kind of relationship, just as there is a relationship between the ethics and the politics for Aristotle, so that they make a whole, and you can't separate one from the other. But that second part of chapter 5, I'm going to leave to the side for the moment. As far as justice as a mean, Aristotle says that it's a mean in two senses as a virtue. So justice is a mean between doing injustice and suffering injustice. So that's kind of an odd way of thinking about it, that we don't want to do injustice and we don't want to suffer injustice, and so justice itself is a mean between these two things. I think that might need some further elaboration on Aristotle's part, or from those who want to contribute to Aristotelian studies or a conception of justice. But of course, he's capturing the idea that, no, we don't want to suffer injustice, and we don't want to do injustice. And so we're looking for something between those two. In another way, justice is a mean because injustice is of extremes, so either having too much or having too little. And so justice is trying to find the middle ground there of having just the right amount at the right time. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we'll continue with further lectures on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics in other videos. Thank you.